understanding the difference you make. I hope that you can all hear me okay, and there's sound and picture quality is good. Just to give you a quick introduction to the session, my name's Alex Stevenson. I'm Head of Essential and Life Skills at Learning and Work Institute in the UK. We're an independent policy research and development organisation working on lifelong learning, employment and inclusion. And we're really delighted to be presenting this webinar as part of the REGALE project, which is Regional Capacity for Adult Learning and Education. It's an Erasmus Plus partnership coordinated by the European Association for the Education of Adults and the European Association of Regional and Local Authorities for Lifelong Learning. It's a really large consortium of partners, and unfortunately I can't list everybody involved, but we're really delighted to be part of that to bring you this webinar today. So as I said, the title of the webinar is Understanding the Difference You Make. We are focusing on the role of evidence and evaluation in adult education and lifelong learning. Just to say before we get into too much more of the detail, that we will be recording the session. Everything goes on the REGALE website and Moodle, so there will be an opportunity to catch up on everything afterwards. We'll share all the materials and so on, and whilst we have an opportunity for live question and answer and so on in the webinar today, there will be other people who will access the webinar after the event through the Moodle course. So I'm just going to share the programme for the morning. So through the purpose of the webinar, really, we want to help to develop an understanding of the role of evidence and evaluation in understanding the impact of adult learning. What difference does adult learning make? We're going to share with you an evaluation toolkit called Understanding the Difference You Make, and that's aimed at supporting providers of adult learning to conduct evaluations of their own programmes. And we're going to hear from an adult learning organisation who has experience of using this evaluation toolkit as part of their own work. So we've got a really great lineup of speakers for the webinar today. We're going to hear in a moment or two from my colleague Naomi Clayton, who's Deputy Director here at Learning and Work Institute, who'll be talking about the role of evaluation in adult learning. My colleague Corin Egglestone will talk us through the evaluation toolkit, and then we'll be hearing from Claire Collins, who is an adult literacy consultant and teacher who has used the evaluation toolkit as part of one of her projects. So that should take us around about an hour or so. We will have time for questions and so on throughout the webinar, so please do feel free to add those into the chat box, and there'll be an opportunity to ask questions live later on as well. But I think for now, that's everything in terms of an introduction from me. So I'm going to hand over to Naomi and ask her to say just a few words about adult learning and evaluation.
Lovely, thank you, Alex, and welcome everybody to this webinar. I think this is a really important subject. I'm going to talk a bit about why we think it's so important that we develop our understanding of what works in adult learning, and why it's important to make sure that we've got collectively a shared understanding of the impact that adult learning has. So firstly, why is it so important? And I think we all probably understand the role that adult learning plays. We know that it plays an essential role in increasing productivity, in improving living standards, helping people and kind of individuals adapt to changing economic circumstances and changes in the labour market. And it also helps to support social mobility too. And we've done work as an organisation on that. To try and quantify some of the impacts. We also know that it can improve employment outcomes at various stages of individuals' working lives, and it helps to support health and well-being and social integration as well. So adult learning is incredibly important, and I probably don't need to tell you all that, but we quite often don't fully understand the impact that adult learning has, and quite often there isn't a shared understanding, and that impact isn't quantified. I think it's particularly important when we're making the case for investment in adult learning. We've seen that's incredibly important in the UK context, where levels of investment have fallen significantly over the past decade. And alongside a kind of greater investment in adult learning, supported by a better understanding of the impact that adult learning has, is to better understand what works to drive up levels of participation and attainment in adult learning. Again, in the UK context, we've seen a significant fall in participation in adult learning over the last decade. And within that, it's particularly important to understand what works for disadvantaged learners as well. We know that disadvantaged learners are significantly less likely to participate in adult learning, and better understanding what works for disadvantaged learners would help to improve inequalities in access, raise attainment levels, and help to improve outcomes as well. So I guess that's the kind of case for better understanding the impact that adult learning has. We know also from the UK perspective, it's particularly important when we're going through a time of quite significant reform in the kind of FE, adult education space as well. So we're in the process in the UK of implementing a new skills bill, which is effectively designed to improve how the skills and post-16 education system functions in England. It's particularly important as we're seeing adult education being increasingly devolved to regional areas and our devolved administrations, so in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, which I think creates both a need and an opportunity to better understand what works in adult education. And in terms of what we mean by what works, it's a term that's kind of quite frequently used in the UK. We have a What Works network that spans a number of different policy areas. And really the focus is trying to understand the impact that different initiatives and approaches have in different policy areas, with a focus on kind of really high quality evidence that focuses on the effect that an intervention has, taking account of different factors. So it's really about trying to understand cause and effect. And doing that is even more important given kind of funding constraints and kind of economic change that we're seeing. And at the moment in adult education, there's a gap, essentially, and the evidence base is certainly, from our perspective, less well established than other policy areas. So, for example, we conducted in 2019 an international evidence review in adult education to look at kind of different studies that try to understand kind of what works to boost participation and attainment in adult education and training. And I think what was most striking about that review was that we found that 63 studies met the minimum standard for quality. So kind of the types of study that can tell us something about the impact of different initiatives and approaches. And that really stands in quite stark contrast to other policy areas, and particularly the schools sector, where the Education and Endowment Foundation, which is essentially our What Works Centre for Education and Schools, they would have over 3,000 kind of comparable studies. So there's a really kind of stark difference in terms of the amount and kind of quality of evidence that we've got in adult learning when it comes to understanding what works. And certainly we feel in the UK, there's room for a more structured and kind of systematic approach to kind of producing evidence and kind of sharing what works, because at the moment I think we've got relatively limited evidence on the effectiveness of different interventions, understanding what works for whom and in what context, and very little information on the cost effectiveness of different approaches too, which is obviously incredibly important when we're operating in an environment with quite significant funding constraints. So, you know, as an organisation, Learning and Work really felt that if we helped to tackle some of these shortfalls, that could help inform policy, make the case for investment, and help to maximise the impact of adult learning too. And it was within that context that we set up the What Works unit for Learning and Work at Learning and Work, which is really designed to try and promote and enable the use of evidence in decision making in learning and skills, as well as in the employment space. And I guess kind of our activities within that centre are kind of focused on kind of four main areas. So kind of one is understanding the challenges, so understanding kind of key trends in the labour market, key trends in participation and attainment, and understanding what's happening across different kind of demographic groups and areas. Then working to kind of summarise the best available evidence, so looking at kind of international evidence across kind of skills and employment areas. And we've conducted a number of What Works reviews, one on basic skills, which basically aims to identify the most effective approaches to developing adult basic skills, and where possible their cost effectiveness. We're supporting the use of evidence, so working with policymakers and practitioners to disseminate the available evidence and kind of understand how that can be applied through kind of policy development and practice. And then crucially, given the kind of general lack of evidence compared to other policy areas, helping to generate and develop new evidence. So an example here is our flagship New Futures programme, where we're developing and delivering 5 pilots across the UK to try and better understand what works to help adults re-skill, particularly in the context of the pandemic, and trying to help individuals who may well need to re-skill and find kind of new careers as a result of the pandemic. And then, and as this webinar is focused on this morning, helping organisations understand the impact that they have. And I think Corin's going to talk about that in more detail. But I think it's an incredibly important area. Clearly, there's work to do relative to other kind of policy areas and sectors, but we feel that there's a huge amount of opportunity to better understand what works and really kind of demonstrate the impact that adult learning has.
Thanks, Naomi. A very clear and compelling case there for the need to do more around evaluation in adult learning. I can see that we've had a quick question while you've been talking. So Panagiota, I hope I'm saying your name right, in Cyprus, is asking if there's a link for the study on participation in adult learning. So I might just ask if Naomi, maybe you can find that or the post something on our What Works Centre in the chat while we move on to the next item. So I'm sure we can find that research study for you. So I'm going to hand straight over to Corin, who's a research manager in our What Works unit. And Corin's going to talk us through the Understanding the Difference You Make evaluation toolkit. So over to you, Corin.
Hi everyone. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, hope everyone can see that. Great, right, thanks, Angit. So as we mentioned, the purpose of this presentation is to introduce a toolkit that Learning Work Institute developed as part of our role as evaluation partner in a UK grant funding programme called the Nesta Career Tech Challenge. And we believe this toolkit can be very useful to help adult education providers to evaluate adult skills provision. Before we get onto the toolkit, wanted to talk a little bit about evaluation, what we mean by evaluation when we talk about it and why it's important. So evaluation examines the implementation and outcomes of a programme to assess whether the anticipated effects, costs and benefits were in fact realised. Evaluation identifies what works, where problems arise, highlights good practice, identifies unintended consequences or unanticipated results, and assesses value for money. Importantly, conducting evaluation of programmes allows you to demonstrate their impacts with a level of reliability and robustness. It allows you to have confidence in the results and what impact has occurred. Evaluation, very different ways of grouping it, but it can be grouped into 2 main types. So impact evaluation, which provides an objective assessment of what changes have occurred as a result of a course or a programme, the scale of those changes and the extent to which these can be attributed to an intervention or to a programme. Impact evaluation answers the question, what difference has a programme made? And then the second type is process evaluation. So process evaluation assesses whether a project or a program or a course is being implemented as intended, how things are working in practice, what's working well, and also importantly, what's not working so well. Process evaluation answers the question, what can be learned from an intervention, from how the intervention or program was delivered. As Naomi mentioned, evaluation is very important in adult education to assess a number of issues. This includes generating evidence around what works in engaging learners and increasing individuals' motivation to participate in courses, to help you to find out what is and is not effective in a program, to help future decision making as an organisation and inform future policies across adult learning, and to provide evidence of impact to support funding applications for courses or programmes. Before we go on to the toolkit, I thought it would be useful to share some examples of where evaluation has made a real impact on courses or programmes in adult education or training. So the first example on this slide is the community-based language intervention, or CBEL, which is a UK programme. So CBEL is aimed at individuals with very low levels of functional English proficiency and involves 66 hours of guided learning and support delivered over 11 weeks. L&W conducted an evaluation of this programme. We did both a process and an impact evaluation with the aim of testing whether CBEL was effective in improving learners' ability to communicate in English, but also importantly, whether it helped them to integrate into their wider community and society. We used a randomized controlled trial to do this, which is the gold standard of evaluation, comparing two groups of learners who both participated in the course but did so at different times, which enabled you to compare outcomes between the two. The evaluation found that the course had both made a strong and sizable difference in overall English proficiency, but importantly, it had also increased social mixing and integration. And this uncovered quite a wide range of areas, such as number of social interactions people had, friendships being formed, levels of trust in other people, confidence in talking to health professionals and visiting shops. So quite a wide range of social impacts. Now, much of these social impacts, the tutors would already know from anecdote and from experience that that type of thing was happening. But the key point here is that doing the evaluation in a robust way helped to demonstrate these findings in a reliable and robust manner, helped to give confidence in these wider impacts. And as such, the findings helped to secure continued government investment in community-based English language provision. The second example here is an interesting one, as it shows the importance of finding negative results in an evaluation as well as positive results. So this is another UK example, and it's based on a programme, an intervention which was developed by a UK organisation called the Behavioural Insights Team, which was for 16 to 19-year-olds who were retaking national exams, which are normally sat at age 16 in further education settings. And the intervention was called Project Success, and it involved sending text messages either to individuals or to family members to encourage them to attend classes and exams, engage with study materials and form better study habits. And there was an initial pilot evaluation of this intervention of sending these text messages, which found positive results and found improvements in the pass rate when students resat these exams. And because of these findings, the programme was rolled out across 31 further education colleges to about 4,000 students. However, this was just a pilot evaluation, and so a full evaluation was conducted afterwards, another randomized controlled trial. And this full evaluation actually found no impact, found that these text messages weren't actually encouraging people to study more or to have improved engagement, and wasn't impacting the success rate of students retaking exams. So although the initial findings were positive, the full evaluation found no effect. And therefore, this intervention was discontinued. There was no improvement due to it. And so the resources which had been put into it could then be channeled elsewhere to more effective programs. And briefly, third example here is for an employment and training program in America, run by a training provider in New York. The program aimed to train low-paid workers in the IT sector for a 15-week occupational training program and career readiness service. An evaluation of the program found that there was a substantial impact of this program on employment and earnings. So participants had about 27% higher earnings than individuals who hadn't taken part in the program, the control group. And this evidence was impressive enough and substantial enough that the program was then expanded into a number of other states in America. So 3 quick examples there, but they show how evaluation can be used to demonstrate impact and maintain funding. Can also be used to expand successful programs and demonstrate why that's important. But it can also be used to redirect resources from programs which are not working to those which are more effective. So main point of this presentation is to introduce our evaluation toolkit. This was developed by Learning and Work, as mentioned, as part of our role in the Career Tech Challenge Fund. So the Career Tech Challenge Fund was launched by a UK organisation called Nesta in 2019 in partnership with the UK's Department for Education, and is aimed to identify and test new digital and online learning interventions that are effective in building career adaptability and learner motivation amongst people who are working in shrinking sectors and occupations. So people who are at risk of losing their job, for example, through automation or long-term industrial changes. And one of the key aspects here is the testing of programs. So a total of 11 organisations were awarded grant funding to develop and to test new approaches. So this was a mixture of adult learning providers and technology development organisations. And although there was a mixture of size and experience, a substantial proportion of these organisations were small, who didn't have any prior evaluation experience. But as part of the grant funding requirements, they were all required to evaluate their own programme to help to find out what works in this area and see how effective their specific approach was and why it was effective or not effective. So Learning and Work Institute's role in this programme was as an evaluation and capacity building partner. So we supported organisations to develop and conduct their own evaluations rather than evaluating the programmes ourselves. And one of the main resources we developed to support them to do this was our evaluation toolkit, Understanding the Difference You Make. So the toolkit is non-technical and practical. It's not aimed at evaluation specialists, and you don't need to have any prior experience or knowledge of evaluation in order to use it to set up an evaluation of your own course or programme. The intention is for it to cover the basics. So it doesn't cover some of the more complex statistical methods or areas such as cost-benefit analysis or counterfactual assessments. But it's a good starting point in those areas, and as I say, covers the basics to get you going. It includes information, guidance and examples on key aspects of the evaluation process. This includes theories of change, So for those who aren't aware, aren't familiar with them, theories of change are a way of setting out the relationship between the inputs and activities associated with a project and the outputs and outcomes which you are aiming to achieve. So very commonly used in evaluations as a way of understanding each step of a program or of a course and how each bit feeds into the other, and then what you need to test in the evaluation to see how well it's working. The toolkit also covers process evaluations, so looking at what's working well and what's working less well and why. And this includes suggestions on how to design topic guides for conducting interviews with learners or with members of staff, guidance on the use of research tools for process evaluations. It covers the collection and analysis of participant information, sometimes called management information. So this is information about individual learners, which as an organisation, you'll probably be collecting anyway. So things like information on demographics, information on backgrounds, potentially information on whether they've progressed into further education or employment after taking part in the programme. And the toolkit discusses how to optimise collection of this and how to analyse this to look at what groups are taking part, groups who may have missed out, and different potential outcomes. It also covers using outcomes tools to assess impact, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail in a second. Analysis of all the data that you'll collect in an evaluation and how to go about reporting that, and ethical considerations. So outcomes tools. So this is one bit of the toolkit that's worth going into in a little bit more detail because it might be new to some people. Outcomes tools, or social metrics they're sometimes known as, are increasingly being used to measure wide outcomes of adult learning. So not just improvements in proficiency or the achievement of qualifications or progression into further learning or employment, sort of standard hard outcomes. Outcomes tools can measure wide outcomes such as improved confidence, improved attitudes towards learning, improved self-efficacy, social integration, mental health and well-being. So a whole range of different participant attitudes, behaviours and skills which might have improved while they've been taking part in the programme. So the idea of outcomes tools isn't to replace those sort of traditional measures, things like proficiency or qualifications or progression, but to try and measure the range of additional benefits that adult learning can have. It's a way of recognising, testing and measuring some of those wider benefits that, as I mentioned with the CBEL programme at the beginning of the presentation, might well already be known through anecdote or experience, but need to be demonstrated in a robust and reliable way. There are quite a wide range of established, robust and validated tools which exist to measure outcomes across a range of different areas. And these tools indirectly measure outcomes. So generally you don't ask someone specifically whether something has improved while they've been taking part in the course. Outcomes tools are designed to be measured before and after a course or a program. So you will assess someone's, for example, mental health and well-being at the beginning and the end of a program, and then see how it compares between the two. So you're not asking someone whether their mental health has improved, you're trying to establish a baseline at the start and then retest it at the end and see whether there's been any change over that period. And commonly you would do that using a survey. So you'd survey learners at the start of a course or program, survey them again at the end and compare the results. It's important to mention that outcomes tools can't show causality unless you have some form of randomization, such as a randomized control trial or similar. So you can't use an outcome tool for a group of learners and be definitive that if there's been an improvement in one of these areas, that has been caused by the program. But if you have a group of learners who on average have quite a substantial improvement in one of these areas, then that's a strong indication that there's an impact in this area, particularly if that those results repeat when you rerun the course. So they're a very useful thing to try and include in an evaluation to try and assess impact. So a couple of quick examples of the types of outcome tools included in the toolkit. So this first one is an attitudes towards learning tool, which is based on a scale developed by two researchers called Blunt and Yang in 2002. And this tool asks a range of questions, both positive and negative, about adult education. And the idea is that you can use them to assess whether your course or program has had an impact on learners' attitudes and motivations to learning, whether they're more positive about adult education after participating in the course than they were before. And this tool is quite simple to use. So you do a survey at the start of the course and a survey at the end of the course. And you'd assign a score to each response to each of these questions. So if someone strongly agreed, you might assign a score of 5. If they agreed, a score of 4, and so on. And then you just simply add up the scores, each question for each participant, and take an average score for the group as a whole, which you could then compare before and after the course to see if the scores had increased over the period of the program. And if the scores had increased, then that would indicate that there was improved attitudes towards adult education. And then the second tool wanted to show you was confidence in digital learning tool. So this tool was a bespoke tool developed by Learning and Work Institute for the Career Tech Challenge evaluation. And that's because when we were searching for existing outcomes tools, we couldn't find any which were quite appropriate for measuring confidence in digital learning. So the idea of these questions is that they're useful in assessing whether learners' confidence in using digital learning resources or digital learning tools has increased after taking part in a course or program. And this is a very simple tool. It just asks 5 simple questions about accessing and using digital learning. Again, to analyze this tool, you would just include it in a survey at the beginning and at the end of learning. And then for each of these questions, you just consider separately the number who agreed or disagreed with them at the beginning of the course and at the end of the course to see if there was any improvement. Both of these tools are included in the toolkit with a wide range of other tools covering quite a range of different outcome areas. So finally, final slide, just wanted to give an example of how one of the organisations in the Career Tech Challenge used the toolkit to conduct an evaluation. So through the funding, an organisation called Game Academy developed a video game-based learning programme designed to support adults to gain employability skills. Now, as mentioned before, as part of the funding requirements, Game Academy were required to evaluate their programme, but they were quite a small organisation who hadn't had any or had very small amount of experience of evaluation in the past. So they used the toolkit to design their evaluation. They decided to do both a process and an impact evaluation. So to look at both identifying and evidencing the impact of their programme, but also understanding how the programme caused these impacts. And they use the toolkit to help them to develop topic guides for research interviews, to help them to design surveys and include those outcomes tools, and also to analyse data they collected about participants on enrolment. And as a result of the evaluation, they were able to identify quite a wide range of significant improvements for learners, both in terms of proficiency, but also those wider outcomes, so improvements to things such as confidence and career adaptability. The evaluation also identified key parts of their programme which had helped to support these improvements. So in their case, it was a blend of semi-automated and semi-live experiences, which have been the real key part of the programme to help participants to develop their confidence and motivation. So the evaluation provided important evidence both of the impact of the course, but also what aspects of the course have contributed to that impact. So Game Academy found these results very useful. They intend to continue using the tools, particularly the outcome tools, in their work going forwards to try and keep track of how their courses are impacting learners. Importantly, they also shared their evaluation report with funders as a way of evidencing their impacts, so showing the impacts that the course can have. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation. Are there any questions?
Thanks, Corin. That's a really helpful overview of the evaluation toolkit. I can see in the chat that we've got a question from Isaac May at Belfast Metropolitan College, who is talking about, sounds like an evaluation with a large number of individual participants, and pointing out that when you have a large number of participants, it can be challenging to analyse the data. The question is whether there is any advice or guidance in the toolkit on managing that aspect of an evaluation.
Yeah, so the toolkit goes through how to set up the data analysis so that it's most easily manageable. So putting together a spreadsheet of results and how that can be done in an effective way, and then how results can be most effectively presented. So when you have a large number of respondents, it's a large number of participants, sorry, it's about doing it in that systematic and sort of as automated a way as possible, using tools such as Excel to do it. So yes, there's guidance in there on how to do that. Having such a large number of individuals does give the possibility of doing some sort of wider statistical testing on it, which a toolkit doesn't cover, but it does signpost towards resources that can be used to look into that.
Thanks, Corin, that's great. So if you do have any further questions for Corin, please feel free to pop them into the chat box and we will have time to pick up on those. But for now, I'm going to move straight on to hear from Claire Collins, who's an adult literacy consultant and teacher, and who was involved in a project to develop a mobile phone app for adult literacy called Citizen Literacy. And I'm sure we'd all be really, really interested to hear much more about an adult literacy mobile phone app. But for the present purposes, we're going to talk about the role of evaluation in the design and development of that app, because Claire's project was one of the ones that was supported by the Understanding the Difference You Make toolkit. So welcome, Claire. Thank you so much for joining us. First of all, can I just ask you, as I mentioned, you were part of a project to develop a mobile phone app for adult learning. And also you were part of, you were required as part of this project to evaluate your project. So what benefits did you find to the evaluation part of the program, and what, you know, from your experience, how was that different to what you'd done before, and what did you get out of it?
Hi, Alex. And yeah, we were one of the 11 organisations who were supported. Ours was a project where we all felt very passionate, and that's quite common in adult learning. We believe in why we're doing it. For us, it was about complete beginner readers and writers, adults who had been out of education for a long time. And so it was very tempting to take individual quotes and individual stories as evidence that our app was making a very big impact on people, making a big difference. The evaluation toolkit required us to take a much more systematic approach to understanding what was happening, but importantly, why it was happening. Now, Corin mentioned the theory of change, and we do have evaluation experts in our team, but even for those people with experience, asking the question, why are we doing this? What do we think it will result in? And is that actually happening? Was quite powerful and made us stop and think very carefully about our processes. Our learners on our app were what you might call at-risk adult learners. Many of them hadn't gone into a college or adult learning service for many years. We felt that if we had become too heavy, then we might lose them. They might not come back to us for more support. And that made us want to tread very carefully in our questioning. But actually the toolkit said, no, come on. You have to ask strong questions because this is people's lives. This is government investment, taxpayers' money. Of course, you need to protect the people you're working with, but please respect the fact they're adults and understand what is happening to them. I don't know if that makes sense, but we were in danger of being too soft. And it's very common for us when we have a social justice purpose in what we're doing, but the toolkit required us to be much more careful and systematic, as I said.
Thanks, Claire. I think that's really interesting, particularly, on the point around, how sometimes, and this, I think, definitely my experience in the sector as well, that we get really sort of enthusiastic and passionate about our work and what we're doing, but there's a need sometimes just to pause and reflect and be really systematic about it. And as Corin mentioned, sometimes we have a good instinct for what the impact will be through our learner case studies and anecdotal evidence. So evaluation is not about kind of correcting that, but it's about putting it on a more robust basis and maybe doing it in a way that generates evidence in a way that policymakers, for example, can see is more robust than some of our traditional practices. So I think that's a really interesting message there, and just taking that time to systematically think things through, and why do we do certain things in adult learning programs and not others. I mean, that sounds like that was a really useful experience, but I'm sure that it can't all have been straightforward and without any difficulties. So I wanted to ask you about the challenges as well. So when you were sort of moving towards a more systematic approach, you already mentioned sort of, perhaps asking learners, slightly more direct, slightly more challenging questions, but did you experience any challenges in embedding an evaluation into your project? And if you did, can you tell us a bit about what the challenges were and how did you overcome those challenges?
So our first challenge was that our participants were beginner readers and writers, so we couldn't send them surveys. Our app is predicated on no text, which seems very counterintuitive, but that's for another day. So Corin, you mentioned topic guides. Now, the topic guides were our way in which we could plan out the questions we were going to ask people. And we had to get the management information or the participant data, age, ethnicity, etc., verbally. And straight away, we realised that we, as the evaluation partners, couldn't speak to every single learner. Actually, we might not have access to every learner because very often there was a mediator. It could be somebody's daughter who was guiding them to use the app and encouraging them to develop their reading and writing. So first challenge was, how do we ask all these questions when we can't use a survey? We have to do everything verbally. Secondly, how can we write a topic guide for a mediator who isn't an evaluation specialist? And for us, ethics was a massive issue. We don't believe that because you can't read and write, you're any less intelligent than anyone else, or any less able, or indeed that your life is any less rich. We just believe there's one part of your life where you've missed out on your education. And we wanted the people who were speaking directly to our participants not only to ask the right questions, but do so with the right ethos. So we had to think very carefully about our topic guides as practical tools, but also as adult literacy awareness raising tools about how you put this into a framework in your own mind when you're talking to others. So that was a challenge. And I think you overcome that by working as a team and asking the participants, how does this feel when we ask you this question? You have to test out your questions directly before you pass them across to a middle person, if that's your challenge. The other challenge for us was that we learned things at the end we wished we'd asked at the beginning. And so, Corin, you said, when you do it a second time, you'll know what to ask. We only had one time on this project. For example, we found that people's geographical lives opened up dramatically as a result of developing confidence in literacy. They knew how to read a bus timetable more confidently, and therefore wouldn't just go to the local shop, but might go to the local supermarket further away. That was fascinating. It was an unexpected finding. And we wished we had asked those bigger social metric questions at the beginning around those kinds of things, because we could have measured more than anecdotally that this was an outcome of the programme. So what can you do? Well, you will get unexpected findings. You will wish that you'd asked them at the beginning. I'd say do cycles of evaluation if you can, because each time you do it, it's going to get better, and you need to learn about the questions that are the right questions for your cohorts.
Thanks, Claire. There's a couple of really important messages there, I think. Firstly, on the sort of research ethics side of things, and I think adult literacy learners are a really good kind of case in point for this, because of the specific disadvantages that people face if they have low literacy skills. But I think we could probably broaden that out to many other kinds of adult learners who may face specific barriers to participating in an evaluation, and the need to be inclusive and accessible and ethical in how how research activities and evaluation activities are designed and implemented is a really, really important point that I think we can all take away from that. And also your second point there about evaluation isn't just a sort of one-off sort of event that you would want to do more than one, so that you can embed the learning as you develop programs, and so hopefully depending on the context in which you're working, there's the opportunity to revisit, ask the questions that you wish you'd asked the first time, but also build upon your learning as you go along, so it feeds into the ongoing program design. Just to wrap up, Claire, I mean, if you were to sort of, well, I know that as part of your consultancy work, you do advise other organisations and providers. If providers were considering evaluating, an aspect of their work or a new programme, what things would you advise them to think about, and would you have any top tips for adult education organisations on the use of evaluation?
So my first thing is start early. The theory of change really works if you start with it at the beginning. It's not so helpful if you start halfway through, because actually you can't design the programme properly unless you think about evaluation from the start. So that's my headline message. if you can, involve some of your participants in discussions about your evaluation process. We had concerns that some of the questions, the metric questions, which we know that the client required us to ask, we were worried that they would alienate some of our learners. Questions about studying and questions about income, for example. Actually, they might not have alienated them had we spoken to the participants about them and sat in a room with 3 or 4 people and said, what do you think about this question? Would this be offensive? Would it put you off the programme? So if you can, bring some of your participants into early discussions about the kind of questions you will be asking them and their peers. Work with the questions. We did have to adapt some of them, and it was okay. Thankfully, Hazel, who is our key contact at Learning and Work Institute, really understood adult literacy. And when we said, we don't think we can ask this question, she said, okay, we'll work around that, that's fine. And whilst, Isaac, you had the opposite challenge to us, you had you've got a lot of learners who you want to understand using perhaps some quite sophisticated data analytics. We had very few learners. It's quite an intense programme with fewer participants. And that's okay too. You know, we sometimes wanted to draw some big conclusions, and Hazel would say, come on now, that's only 5 people saying that. It's not, you can't say that, but you can say there are indications for future evaluations, future research projects that you might want to have a look at. So it can work with small and large numbers. Involve the people who you're working with. They are your greatest they're your greatest resource to understand whether what you're asking is okay, and start straight away. And one more thing, if you want to see our evaluation, we're very proud of it. We're proud of what we achieved in the programme. I'm popping a link in chat now, and please don't do it before the end of the meeting, because poor Alex won't be able to talk to you because you'll be reading. But there's something you can have a look at there if you're interested.
Brilliant. Thank you, Claire. Thank you for sharing the evaluation. I'm sure many people will be interested to read it, and lots of great common sense tips there, you know, getting started early. But I particularly like the point about involving the participants in the design of the evaluation. And I think that's really important. I've been involved in some projects as well with Corin, where we've looked at, you know, embedding different kinds of metrics, and we've had very different responses as to whether, oh, can you ask learners this, or is that going to be off-putting or offensive to some? And the simplest answer is, well, test it out with some learners first, and sometimes you might be surprised at the answers you get back, because I think that point that you were making earlier, Claire, sometimes we can maybe a little bit overprotective as to what we can ask people to do, and you know, we should be treating people like adults, and they can make their own decisions and give us their own feedback as to whether they think something's appropriate or not. And if that's all done in the right kind of sensitive way, then you know, it's going to make for a stronger evaluation. So really important messages there. Thank you for joining us, Clara. I hope that the evaluation process was something useful to you, and it sounds like it was, so that's great. Just to pick up on some final questions, and if anybody does have any questions for Claire about her project, we do have a few more minutes. I just want to pick up from a question in the chat from Isaac, and it may be one that's maybe more for Naomi or Corin to come back on. But first point is about, you know, structuring the setup or governance of the evaluation process. So I guess some thoughts on, you know, who's it feeding into and why, and how do you set that up? And I think the example there where we talked about the learner achievement text message example, where, you know, it found that actually that wasn't having much of an impact. I guess, you know, how do we ensure that those evaluation findings and evidence are kind of, you know, those messages get through to the right places, I guess, is the question underpinning that. So I don't know, Corin, firstly, whether there's anything specifically in the in the toolkit on the setup of evaluation. But then perhaps after whether there isn't or there isn't, perhaps if I can ask Naomi briefly to sort of, you know, to come back on that point about where does evaluation sit and how's it governed, and how do we structure it to have impact. So Corin, first of all, is there anything in the toolkit on that specific point?
Yes, there is. So the toolkit covers evaluation planning and setup, and a key part about REGALE is on deciding what you want to find out from the evaluation, what the sort of key things are that you're interested in. And that example of Game Academy in the presentation, they use the toolkit to decide to focus on those two specific areas, what the impact was and what parts of the program were causing that specific impact. But there are other areas that you can focus on. So it's deciding right at the beginning, and it's always good practice where possible, where feasible, to start the evaluation process during the course or program design rather than to add it as a bolt-on at the end. It's not always possible, but where it is possible, starting everything from the beginning so everything can be considered together. So yeah, so the toolkit does go into some details about all of that.
Great, thank you, Corin. And perhaps Naomi, do you have any sort of wider thoughts on, you know, how do we ensure that, you know, evaluation is used in such a way that it has an impact on policy development? I mean, I guess that some of that will depend specifically on who's commissioned the evaluation and why. So you would hope that if it was government commissioned, then they would be listening to the findings of that evaluation. But I guess if it's, you know, if it's around, you know, individual projects and providers evaluating, then I guess it's a you know, there's perhaps we're looking for other channels to communicate the impact of some of that evaluation work.
Yeah, and I think ensuring that your evaluation has impact, I think a lot of the points that Claire and Corin have made already are really relevant there. So the points that have been made around kind of starting early, being clear on what you're trying to achieve through a program and what your measures of success are obviously really critical. And I guess thinking about who your audience is for the evaluation. So there's something around, you know, how you learn from the evaluation as an organisation, as a set of practitioners, but it's thinking kind of more widely about, you know, who else do you want to influence with the evaluation, and thinking about how you kind of communicate with them kind of early on and as the program develops. I think the governance point is really important. It may be appropriate in some circumstances to establish a kind of independent evaluation panel, where, you know, you bring together a kind of group of kind of experts, independent kind of external advisors to oversee the evaluation on a panel, and that can help to kind of demonstrate the kind of quality and effectiveness of the evaluation itself. But yeah, I think I'd go back to the points that Corin and Claire have been making about, you know, really kind of starting early, integrating the evaluation into the project design right from the start, thinking about, you know, what exactly are you aiming to achieve, and how are you defining success? And that's where the kind of theory of change development is so important. And crucially understanding what is it exactly that you want to evaluate. I mean, I talked at the beginning a lot about kind of what works and understanding the impact of programs, but just as important is understanding, you know, why a program has worked from an implementation point of view, and building in kind of review points and learning points within an evaluation is critical to that kind of learning and the kind of review and redesign of programs, which is why one of the reasons why evaluation is so important. Yes, I think also thinking about how long an evaluation should be too, and that relates to kind of what your measures of success are. You know, you may, for instance, want to design an evaluation that runs after the delivery of a particular program has ended, so you can understand the longer term impacts, which may be particularly important when you're thinking about the kind of wider audience and who you're seeking to influence with an evaluation.
Thanks, Naomi. That's really helpful, I think, and Claire has chipped in there with some of the points there about, you know, thinking about who's interested in which outcomes and building in the appropriate measures for those. And I think I like the idea as well that, you know, as you know, we are, you know, providers of adult learning, so we should be keen to sort of learn about, you know, how our programs work as well, and be open to that. There are a couple of questions on you know, social return on investment methodology in the chat there. I don't know, Corin, is that something that we consider as part of the toolkit, or is it a bit out of scope? We may not have time to get into full details of different methods and so on now, but I just wonder whether there's kind of any guidance or, you know, further signposting to that in the toolkit.
Yes, that is a bit out of the scope of the toolkit. That comes under the more advanced statistical methods that we talked about. And as a general point, there are robust ways of assigning sort of monetary outcomes, monetary values to different outcomes. There are various different ways of doing it. Social return investment is one of those, which can be very effective in sort of identifying a cost benefit ratio for a program. But yes, it's not something that's covered in the toolkit.
Yeah, I think that's maybe a sort of a good point in itself, isn't it? Because there are lots of, you know, advanced research methods and statistical, you know, and analytical techniques and so on that can be used as part of evaluation, and often are in the most robust studies. But there's a lot that we can be doing as adult learning organisations within our own, you know, sort of existing evaluation work and approaches, just to kind of, you know, make sure that that is as robust and as impactful as it can be, and we can, you know, adopt elements of those approaches for our own purposes without having to become experts. You know, because some of it you would need sort of the external support, and we don't always have the opportunity to have an external evaluation if it's not been funded. But the toolkit, I think, is useful in helping us to think about the things that we can do and embedding some of that in our day-to-day practice. Claire, did you want to come back in on that? I can see you've got your hand up there.
It's just very briefly around social return on investment. It's a real challenge because there has to be agreements at all levels about what value is placed on a certain, for example, reduction in visits to your local GP. And that is a challenge for us because there's very little agreement on how much exactly that's worth, and it changes all the time. However, if your audience is some people in a local area who will listen to the indicators that you have, people are telling us that they've made fewer visits to the doctor's surgery as a result of being more confident to look things up online. If that message might not be robust using that language, Alex, it might not speak to national government, but it might very well speak to your colleague on the desk over there who's responsible for planning local doctor advice and guidance. So I think I'm really interested to see how you get on with this, Isaac, in Belfast, because I hope that people are able to respond to what you find and understand the wider benefits of your programmes.
That's a really good point to finish on as well, to think about, you know, the kind of impact that you can collect, and is it fit for purpose for the purpose that you have in mind, and for your local stakeholders might be just as important as, you know, to have that local impact and to make a service or provision better, as it, you know, as it's not always about sort of contributing to the sort of national evidence base. It could be about a specific impact for a specific purpose as well. So we're going to have to wrap things up there as we come to the end of our time in the session this morning, or afternoon, I think, as we are now, certainly in the UK. So I just want to thank colleagues at Learning and Work Institute, Naomi and Corin, for their contributions, and my colleague Sarah, who's been making the arrangements for the webinar. And thank you, Claire, for joining us today to share your experiences of evaluation. That's really brought things to life, and hopefully given everybody some food for thought in terms of how they might take forward their own approach to evaluation in future. So we will be sharing everything from the session. Just a reminder, this webinar is part of the REGALE project on regional capacity for adult learning and education. So there is an associated website and other resources, and indeed all kinds of other interesting outputs from the project will be there, and we'll be you know, making sure that you get the right information and links and so on, how to access those things as and when they are available. So thank you very much for joining us today. We hope you found it a useful session, and have a great afternoon, everybody.